I mean, the time I was there, we were super early, maybe first in the country, not just on the Spin Doctors, but on, well, all the like hippie rock bands, the Blues Travelers and stuff. Also Beck. We were right behind K-Rock LA in terms of playing Loser. And then Counting Crows. We were like the key station to helping Counting Crows.
And that's the voice of Jim McGuinn from XPN.org, a great AAA station in Philadelphia if you want to check it out. Again, XPN.org. Now, Jim, share more stories about 105.7 The Point in St. Louis.
That was a great time. And sadly, though, like right when I got there, I did have to deal with something that was a really interesting experience, which was the death of Kurt Cobain. So Kurt died 2 weeks after I got to St. Louis, and we went all hands on deck. The morning host, Sarah Clark, stayed on all day. We had kids calling in who were threatening suicide. We had to like suddenly get real and, get like therapists on call to direct people for like mental health issues. And it was such an intense experience. And it was one of those moments in your life when suddenly it's not just fun and games and it's not just playing records you like. It's very real. And I always now, often when I hear Nirvana, I come back to that day in my mind. And I got to see Nirvana live. I had a lot of good experiences with that sort of thing. But that is one. It takes me right back to St. Louis the day he died. Every time.
I remember when it happened. I was just like, dang, I was like, it was sad. I mean, only 27 years old, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, man, I mean, could somebody have helped? I remember when Del Shannon took his own life, and Tom Petty spoke about it, and Petty said, I had no idea he was so depressed. I wished he had told me because I would have been, there for him. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, I mean, so many sad stories in rock history where oftentimes I think the artists look back in retrospect and say, oh, we were just going nonstop. Nobody ever took a minute. Nobody checked in with each other, and I hope that artists today are generally in a little bit better place as far as that goes.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I read a book called Without You, The Tragic Story of Badfinger, and two of their members took their own lives. And the first who did was Pete Ham, and that was because their manager was just bleeding them dry. And they were selling out concerts. They were begging fans for money, and they said, oh, come on, you guys are rich. And they're, no, we're not, because we're not making money. And that oftentimes happens, it seems, with record companies where the artists make their money from the touring, not the record sales themselves, unless you're selling the record independently. I think like Andy DeFranco sold 500,000 copies of her own independent CD from her trunk of her car. So she was able to make money, much more money than somebody who sells millions of copies through the record company.
Yeah. I mean, that's all. It's changed a lot in the years since the mid '70s, but definitely Badfinger is the poster child of a tragic story like that, where they ended up with bad business deals and the band was in a bad place, and and Pete Ham was the main songwriter, so it was awful. I got to know Joey Molland, who was the last surviving member who just passed away a few months ago. And he lived in Minnesota when I was in Minnesota. So I ended up seeing him a couple times, and I interviewed him once, and absolute sweetheart. But yeah, he had the stories about how dire it was for that band in the 70s while they were at the peak, and while they were, they had 5, 6 really big songs, and but never really saw any revenue from it. So.
No, in fact, their last album before Pete passed away was called Wish You Were Here, and it was a Warner Brothers label. I think it was their first or second album on Warner Brothers. And the manager was not paying Warner, and so Warner ended up pulling the album 6 weeks after release with no singles ever released on it. And it wasn't heard for probably about maybe 20 years until finally released on CD. And then another one called Head First, which didn't get released till about 25 years later because Bob Jackson, who'd replaced Joey Mullen for that one album had the master tapes of it, and so he released it himself, kind of rough and raw, but it was actually a pretty good album. It could have been a big success had it been ever released, officially. Yeah. But I heard about Joey Mullen having passed away, and just I was like, man. But I got a question about the last one. Yeah. EQX broadcast from a Victorian style home, I read. Tell us about the special vibe that brought to that station as well.
It was great. And and that station is still going strong. It's still, it's the kind of place where there's 6 or 7 people working there, mostly, and doing everything, like sales calls, traffic department, you name it, production, on air, promotions, everything. It's a really tight unit. And Brooks, the owner, was a real character. He passed away, I'm going to say it's like 12 or 13 years ago now. But his wife, his widow, owns the station and runs it. So she's amazing. She's kept that thing going. It's now 40 plus years on the air, and it's been broadcasting from this Victorian house in Manchester, Vermont. It's like a little resort town, about an hour and 20 minutes outside of Albany, but the stick is on top of a mountain. So the stick goes for miles. It goes so far. And it was amazing. I mean, the era that I was there was some incredible talent, people that went on to work at Sirius, people that went on to be several people. I think 4 people became program directors off of that staff that I had.
Wow.
Which you don't see out of a staff of, a handful, like such a small staff, right? Almost everybody on that team. And I think it was because we were kind of all learning together, and it was a time of extreme creativity in the alternative format and in radio in general in that sort of early to mid 90s. And so there's always been a great crew of people that have come through that station. And, it's always like, it's like a 2-share to a 3-share station. It's very left of center musically, and it's very quirky. But it's a really special place that has helped so many artists. I mean, the time I was there, we were super early, maybe first in the country, not just on the Spin Doctors, but on all the like hippie rock bands, the Blues Travelers and stuff. But also Beck. We were right behind K-Rock LA in terms of helping playing Loser. And then Counting Crows. We were like the key station to helping Counting Crows. And it happened after the Spin Doctors. And I remember I had heard the song Mr. Jones at a conference, a AAA conference. And I came back to the station and played it for the staff. And everyone said, "This is cool. Let's add this." And the record company called and said, "Why did you add Mr. Jones? What are you doing?" And I was like, "This song's awesome." And they said, "Well, we were going to work Rain King to alternative." And I'm like, "Well, I think Mr. Jones is a better song." And they're like, "Okay, whatever." And then they called back and they're like, "We changed our plan. We're going to work Mr. Jones." And I was like, "That's cool." And,
wow.
At the time, none of us knew that song was going to be what it became, right? But every week, and the guy's name was Ted Volk. He was the alternative guy at Geffen Records at the time. He would call me and he'd be like, "Dude, K-Rock added it, or dude, now we're going to go to top 40 with this. We had no idea we were going to go to top 40 with this band." And again, it's another one where the band sold, 10 million copies that album, something like that. So it was proof that you could be in a small market and still kind of change the face of culture, and for me, it was really, that was the thing I loved the most. I love growing an audience. I love building the community, but helping an artist kind of get from A to B through just, embracing and passionately putting a song on the radio was incredible. I don't know if, the world has changed so much since the 90s, because that was when you still had to, you still had to get into record stores. So you still had to have distribution. You still had to have the sort of these machines of record labels. You couldn't come out of nowhere, literally, like you can now, where anybody can put a song on Spotify, and unfortunately, everyone is. It's like it's hard to cut through now. But then there was this coordination that was needed, and to see that stuff happen was like super thrilling.
Well, Jim, it's interesting because you mentioned that, and I'm curious because Freeform FM in the late 60s to mid 70s the DJs themselves had a lot of creative control about breaking new records, saying, okay, this is exclusive, check this out. How much creativity did your jocks at EQX have to ask your permission and say, hey, can we break this new record without having to do like call out research or a focus group and all that other stuff?
Yeah. That was an era when it was definitely, it was a team, and the team would decide cumulative, together, like, yeah, let's go for it. And oftentimes, I'm sure as much as I just named 3 or 4 artists that we had a huge hand in breaking, there were tons of artists that we thought we were going to change the world with that didn't, that we embraced, and they never came home. And part of the joy of that radio station, which is funny that, now I work for WXPN, which is a non-commercial AAA station, has kind of the same mentality of like, we're here for people that want to be, more so than maybe other radio listeners, want to have a little bit of a challenge, want to celebrate the history of music, but also want to discover, and have a curiosity. And that's the same kind of radio I've been doing since the early 90s, whether it was at EQX or, maybe less so when I was at The Point. And then when I came to Philly, I was at DRE and then Y100 and then XPN, and DRE and Y100 were alternative stations, which had various degrees of, I guess you'd say, freedom, but in 2005, I segued to XPN, and then I went to the Current, and then I came back. And those are, these are stations where that freedom still exists, like I kind of think that at a station like the Current or XPN, we're really taking, hopefully, fingers crossed, like what made those progressive stations in the late 60s and early 70s so special, that sense of curation and that sense of shared community, and then adding it to what made college radio great in the 80s, and then also what made alternative radio successful and great in the 90s. And I think if you kind of smush all those things, all those attributes together, that's sort of what non-com is about.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because out here in Southern California, you got the SoCal Sound, which is run by both Cal State Northridge as well as Saddleback College, because they both have the 88.5 signal. And Sky Daniels was the one who really pioneered that, and I forget who's in charge now. In fact, I spoke with Jim Nelson.
A guy named Mookie.
Mookie, that's right.
He's in charge right now. He's great. And Nick Harcourt works there. He was at KCRW, which is even more of a freeform station than KCSN, but KCSN is that's a great station. That's also in the same school, I guess you'd say, or format as where I am and at XPN. KEXP in Seattle is another great one. KUTX in Austin, WFUV in New York. There's 30 or 40 stations that are doing this in medium to large markets and with various degrees of success. And if you're a fan about discovering new music, particularly kind of new rock music, there's no better place to listen or to certainly to be to work, because there is that degree of freedom. There is that room to really curate in a way that you can't get from algorithms. You can't get from the Spotifys of the world. So Sky Daniels is somebody that was a hero of mine when I grew up in Chicago. So he was on the air at the Loop, and he was the guy in 1979. The Loop was pretty mainstream meat and potatoes rock, but he was the guy on at night, and he was playing Talking Heads. He was playing Nick Lowe. He was playing Blondie. He was playing The Police, and that was the music that kind of began my evolution away from, less Bob Seger, more this new music that was about to hit me.
It's interesting. I was at Universal Studios. There used to be a radio station. Well, it was a restaurant called KWGB World's Greatest Burgers. So it had like this pretend radio booth, and we had probably about 1,000 CDs worth of best ofs and compilations from the 60s through 80s. We had a touch of 50s, touch of 90s. And there was a gentleman visiting the restaurant who I think was from Hong Kong. And I played Cruel to Be Kind. He says, "Who is that?" I said, "Oh, it's Nick Lowe." He's like, "Can you write that down?" I said, "Sure." So I wrote it down for him.
Yeah.
Then about an hour later, I get a tap on the glass, and it's that same gentleman. He has a Sam Goody plastic bag, and he pulls out the best of Nick Lowe. So I guess I could take credit for selling at least one Nick Lowe album.
There you go. There you go. You're breaking Nick Lowe.
Breaking Nick Lowe. And, of course, his first wife was Carlene Carter, the daughter of June Carter Cash. So there's a kind of a whole, musical entity right there.
And so, there's one of my favorite Nick Lowe stories is, besides Cruel to Be Kind, his most famous song is he wrote What's So Funny About Peace, Love, and Understanding. And most of the world knows that from a version by Elvis Costello. But Nick Lowe got paid because a guy named Curtis Stigers did a version of that song, which you're like, Curtis Stigers' version is not a hit. It's not, but it was an album track on the Bodyguard soundtrack from Whitney Houston, which sold over 20 million copies. So Nick Lowe got, 8 cents off of each one of those copies that was sold as the songwriter. Like, what's so funny about Peace, Love, and Understanding? He made millions off of that.
Isn't that interesting, where just the weirdest way it's done. Kind of like, the money is in the songwriting. Like, for instance, Danielle Bribois, who played Stephanie first on All in the Family and then Archie Bunker's Place, was a member of New Radicals, but her main success has been songwriting for other artists, and she's made millions of dollars making hits for others. Yeah.
I mean, one of my friends from living in Minnesota is Dan Wilson from Semisonic, and he's written for so many people. He wrote Someone Like You with Adele, and he wrote for the Dixie Chicks, and he wrote, he's hundreds and hundreds of successful songs. And so they call it the mailbox money, Josh, and that's what you want. You can get to the mailbox money. I keep trying, I keep playing in bands, I keep writing songs, and I keep getting my annual statement at the end of the year from ASCAP, and I might make $30 or $40 in the course of the year. I'm like, I'm so proud though. I'm like, hey, it's more than I'm an artist. I made $40. I haven't got the hit. I haven't made the thousands, but doesn't matter. I'm still trying, You gotta keep going.
We're talking with radio personality and assistant program director of XPN, Jim McGuinn. And next time we'll talk about his time in Minneapolis at the Current, as well as the rock and roll legend he shares a name with.